that feeling where you finish editing a video and you're stoked to render it out, and then, like, it's just dot off?
Yeah.
The colors look a bit sad, blacks are kind of murky, the whole thing lacks that, I don't know, pop.
Yeah.
Kind of like looking at a sunrise through a hazy smog instead of, crystal clear air.
What's so interesting there is that this off feeling often comes down to video levels.
Okay.
A seemingly tiny detail that can make or break your video's look.
Levels, is that like volume levels?
Kind of. Both audio and video levels impact how we experience the final product.
Okay.
But in this case, we're talking about the range of brightness encoded in your video file.
Right.
Imagine a painter's palette video levels. Dictate the spectrum of tones you have to depict light and shadow.
Okay, so I'm intrigued. This excerpt from What's the Deal with Levels? Full versus video dives right into this.
Okay.
And mentions how this whole levels thing actually started back in the analog days, like with tapes and such.
Exactly.
Ah.
Back then, the standard was video levels,
Sure.
which, numerically speaking, ranged from 16 to 235 in an 8-bit file.
Huh.
This might seem arbitrary, but it boils down to leaving some breathing room at the top and bottom of the signal, like safety rails.
So pure black wasn't actually 0?
Nope. Pure black was represented by the number 16, and pure white was 235.
Wow.
This headroom and footroom, as it's called, helped prevent distortion and clipping during broadcast, since signals could fluctuate a bit.
That makes sense for old school TV.
Right.
But, like, why does any of this matter in our digital world of ones and zeros? Shouldn't software, I don't know, handle this automatically?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But even though we've moved from tapes to digital files, the software and codecs we use still operate on these historical standards. They're embedded in how video is captured, processed, and displayed, even today.
So even if I'm not consciously, like, thinking about these legacy limitations,
Right.
the software might be working behind the scenes to either honor them or potentially mess things up if I'm not careful.
You got it. And that affects everything from how accurate your colors look to whether your project files play nice between different editing programs,
Oh, wow.
and even how your video looks when uploaded online. If your levels are off, you might end up with that washed-out look you described, with crushed blacks or blown-out highlights.
Wait, so you're telling me that even if I shoot and edit a video that looks perfect on my computer screen, it might look totally different when I upload it
Yeah.
because of how the software is interpreting these levels?
It's definitely possible. Think of it like speaking different dialects of the same language.
Yeah.
If your editing software is speaking video levels, but your output format expects full levels, things can get lost in translation.
Okay.
And that's where things get tricky, because we run into terms like 4.4.4 YUV IRE.
Okay, yeah. That's where I usually start to feel my eyes glazing over.
Yeah.
Can you blame me?
Totally understandable. It sounds intimidating, but you don't need a degree in video engineering to wrap your head around this.
Right.
What's crucial is understanding what your software thinks the levels are, rather than getting lost in the technical jargon. Instead of trying to become fluent in all the dialects, just focus on speaking the right one for the situation.
Right. Make sure everyone's on the same page from the get-go.
Yes.
But that's easier said than done, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's the deal with levels makes it clear that different software handles levels differently, which sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be, if you're not careful. It's like having different translators for the same conversation.
Right.
They all speak the language, but their interpretations can vary.
Right.
Take Nuke, for example, a really powerful compositing software.
Okay.
It defaults to full range levels, where 0 is truly black and 255 is truly white.
Okay.
But then you have something like Avid, a total workhorse in the editing world, and that defaults to video levels with its Rec 709 setting. So right off the bat, you've got two major players using different dialects.
And to make it even more interesting, DaVinci Resolve, another popular editing and color grading tool, does something else entirely.
Yes.
It processes everything internally in full range, 32-bit float, which has way more range than those 8-bit video levels.
Right.
But when you're ready to share your video, it typically outputs to video levels unless you tell it otherwise.
Right.
Hold on, so there's all this back and forth scaling happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Full range to video levels and back, again, depending on what software I'm using and how I've got it configured. It's a wonder anything ever looks right.
That's why getting these fundamentals down is so important. And to add another wrinkle, Premiere Pro, while a very capable editing program, can be a bit more limited than Avid or Resolve when it comes to color management and how it handles these level interpretations.
Okay.
You really need to keep it in mind, especially if you're bouncing between different programs.
And to make things even more confusing, there's ProRes. You
Right.
see this codec everywhere, right? It's like the default language of professional video.
It's everywhere for a reason. ProRes is a high-quality, efficient codec.
Yeah.
But, as you might have guessed, it also brings its own baggage when it comes to levels.
So it's like every time I think I've got a handle on this whole video levels thing, like another layer gets peeled back.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? ProRes is a great example because while it can handle full-range RGB data, according to our source, both DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro often assume that ProRes 444, a specific type of ProRes, is using video levels. So you might think your footage is good to go, but your software could be misinterpreting those levels behind the scenes, which can lead to all sorts of unexpected color shifts.
So even though ProRes could be speaking full range, the software might hear video levels and make incorrect assumptions about how to display it.
Right.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially if I'm collaborating with someone using different software.
You can be if you're not careful. And to add another layer of complexity, DNxHR 444, another high-quality codec, seems to have its own set of quirks. Based on the source material, it sounds like there are inconsistencies in how DaVinci Resolve and Premiere interpret levels in DNxHR 444 files. One might treat it as full range, while the other assumes video levels. It's like they're speaking two slightly different dialects, even though they're supposed to be using the same language.
This is starting to feel like navigating a minefield.
Right.
So if these codecs are potentially ambiguous, how can we even be sure if we're running into level issues in our own projects?
Yeah.
Is there a way to, like, double-check all this behind-the-scenes interpretation?
Absolutely. And thankfully, it's easier than you might think.
Yeah.
The secret weapon. Color bars.
Like those colorful bars they used to show on TV when a channel ended?
Yeah.
I thought those were just a relic of the past.
They might seem like a throwback, but color bars are actually super useful for troubleshooting level issues.
Okay.
If your blacks are being clamped, meaning they're being compressed into a smaller range than they should be, the color bars will reveal it right away. You'll see that the black level isn't as deep and rich as it ought to be, which is a telltale sign that something's off with how the levels are being scaled.
So it's like a little test pattern to check if my software is interpreting and scaling those levels correctly. I'm adding this to my workflow like yesterday. That's super helpful.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, with all this talk about outdated standards and software quirks, is there any chance this whole video levels thing will eventually become obsolete? Will we all just move to a full-range world and leave all this complexity behind?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a topic that's being actively debated in the industry. The trend, especially in high-end productions working with formats like DPX or OpenEXR, those like the Rolls-Royce of image formats, is definitely towards full-range RGB workflows. These formats are all about preserving the highest image quality possible, and they offer a much wider range of color information than traditional video formats.
So is full range like the future-proof option while video levels are just like hanging on due to legacy reasons?
Yeah.
Should I just switch everything over to full range now and be done with it?
It's tempting to think that way, but it's not quite so cut and dried. Video levels are still deeply ingrained in a lot of broadcast television and online content. Those industries are built on these standards, and they're not going away overnight. Plus, using full range for everything might not always be the best approach. Kind of like wearing a tuxedo to a casual backyard barbecue. Technically, you're dressed, but it's not exactly the right vibe.
So it's not about one being better than the other, but rather understanding which tool is best suited for the job, just like with any creative decision.
Exactly.
And knowing how to move between these different worlds without messing everything up.
You hit the nail on the head. It's all about being aware of both standards and understanding which one your workflow is operating within. Don't just assume test it out. Use those color bars we talked about and make sure everyone's on the same page from the get-go.
So as we head into the final stretch, let's switch gears from theory to practice. What are some actionable steps we as creators can take to navigate this world of video levels effectively?
The first thing is to know your source. You need to understand how your camera records levels, whether it defaults to full range or video levels. Dive into those camera settings, read the manual, and don't leave this to chance. It's the foundation of your entire workflow.
Right, because that initial setting will impact everything that comes after in the editing process. It's like making sure you're building your house on solid ground.
Exactly. Once you've got your source figured out, Pay close attention to how your editing software interprets those levels, especially when dealing with those trickier 4.4.4 codecs like ProRes 444 and DNxHR 444. Don't just assume test it.
And that's where those trusty color bars come in handy again, right?
You bet. Use them religiously. Test your exports, check that the blacks aren't being clamped, and make sure those levels are being scaled correctly for your final output. It's a quick and easy step that can save you a lot of headaches down the line.
So, know your camera, know your software, and test, test, test. Sounds like a solid mantra for any video editor.
It really should be. And finally, for most common scenarios like broadcast television, online content, that sort of thing, sticking with video levels is usually the safest bet. That's what those delivery pipelines are designed to handle, and it'll save you a lot of potential compatibility issues down the line.
So it's not that video levels are inherently better in those situations, but rather that they're the expected standard, like speaking the common language of that particular world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Using full range levels for those situations would be like showing up to a casual barbecue in a tuxedo.
Yeah.
Technically, you're dressed, but it's not going to go over very well.
Right.
Know your audience, know your output, and choose the appropriate levels for the job.
So we've got a handle on our cameras, we're keeping a close eye on our software, we're testing with color bars like pros.
Right.
Is there anything else we can do to make sure our videos always look their best? Or are we good to go?
You're well on your way to becoming a levels ninja.
Okay.
But there's one more thing that often trips people up. It involves those tricky 4.4.4 codecs we talked about earlier, specifically ProRes 444 and DNxHR 444.
Okay, those are the high-quality codecs that are super popular, but also prone to some level interpretation issues, depending on what software you use, right?
Exactly. And here's the thing. Sometimes, even if you've got your camera set to video levels and you're exporting with video levels selected in your editing software, these codecs can still throw a curveball.
Hold on. I thought we had this all figured out. I'm starting to feel like I need a spreadsheet just to keep track of all this.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Okay.
The key takeaway here is this. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and experiment a bit.
Okay.
Try exporting a short test clip with your usual settings, using ProRes 444 or DNxHR 444.
Okay.
Then throw those color bars on a second video track. Export that as well and compare the two.
So I'm basically using the color bars as a reference point to see if the blacks and whites are lining up correctly between my main footage and that test pattern. So if those blacks are clamped or washed out, then I know something's not right with how the codec is handling those levels.
You got it. It's a simple check, but it can save you from a world of hurt down the line. If you're noticing any discrepancies, don't panic.
Okay.
It might just mean you need to tweak a setting or two in your editing software.
Right.
For example, some programs have a specific checkbox for enabling full-range output, even when using a video-level codec.
So even within those codecs, there's still some wiggle room to, control how those levels are interpreted.
Yeah.
It's like fine-tuning the translation between those different dialects.
Precisely. And the more you experiment, the more comfortable you'll become navigating these nuances.
Right.
Remember, the goal isn't to memorize a bunch of rules, but to understand the underlying principles so you can troubleshoot effectively.
This has been a seriously eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, any final words of wisdom for our fellow video creators out there?
Just remember, mastering video levels is a journey, not a destination. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, test your assumptions, and keep learning. The more you understand about how this seemingly technical detail impacts your creative work, the more freedom and control you'll have to bring your vision to life.
Beautifully said. And to our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to, keep digging deeper. Explore that debate between full range and video range workflows a bit more. Are we headed towards a future where full range reigns supreme? Or will these two standards continue to coexist, each serving a unique purpose in the ever-evolving world of video? It's fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep those levels balanced.